And hello there, everybody. This is Chris from Feldgrau Productions, and we are back with a painting video, the first in a little while, and it is Orktober, or as I'm going to declare it, Uruk-tober, because we are going to be painting some 10mm Uruk-Hai, although you could certainly use these techniques to paint any sort of orcs, especially of the non-Games Workshop style. In 10mm or 15mm or even 6mm if you want to. So what I have here are some Knucklebones miniatures, 3D printed 10mm figures. This is the Orc Spearman line. They also have a swordsman and a command stand. It's a relatively limited set. This creator Knucklebones Miniatures mostly does 28mm, kind of like weird, grimdark, almost Cthulhu influenced 28mm. Very interesting stuff. I'm actually kind of interested by both their fantasy and their like weird World War One fantasy look. But these are their 10mm, and I'm doing 10mm Lord of the Rings, as many as you know, and I need some Oryx, and this is what I thought would be perfect for the Uruk-hai. They're relatively straightforward, but with a little bit of work, they will work really well because they're fairly uniform, which I want them to look, unlike my orcs and goblins, which are a little more ragtag. So one thing I did do with these, I will point out, is if you go to the Knucklebones on my mini factory, which I'll put a link in the description down below, these actually come in strips of 6, and they're a little shorter. If I put these next to some 10mm figures, then you can see these are Wake's Important 10mm Gondorians. They're taller than the Gondorians, when in reality, they're the same height as the Gondorians, because what I did is I removed the 6th guy and I scaled them up to about 115% because I wanted my Oryx to be imposing and a little bit larger than the humans in my 10mm scale. So you could think of them more or less like 12mm scale if you wanted to think of them like that. So what I've done is I've done a little bit of the work. You can see this is the finished product, and this is what we're going to be going for in the end. And this is super speed paint. This is our starting point. I have already primed it black, and then I've dry brushed it with an ivory. You could use a white, doesn't really matter. And you'll notice I have pre-based these, not in terms of basing, but they're already on the 40 by 20 base. And there's no way I'm getting in between these figures right here. And if you watched my video, painting these guys, these are the Warlord Epics scale figures, although they're 3D printed, I did the same thing, where the figures in the middle, it's a little hard to tell, are barely painted, except the Shakos and the guys on the end. And that's the point. You can't tell what's in the middle of these, and you're going to be barely able to see what's in the middle of these. Case in point, look at the finished ones, you can barely tell that there's not a lot of paint going on in between these guys because it's in the middle. So our first step is going to be, we're going to have a relatively limited set of colors here. You're going to need some sort of metallic. I'm using burnt iron, but really any metallic, like medium metallic is going to work. I'm using a light green, and this is going to look very dramatic in the beginning, but I promise that the wash is going to dull this down a lot because we won't look dirty. For the skin, we're going to use a combination of pure red and this tan earth. So any medium red and lightish brown are going to work. And I found this difficult because if you watch the Lord of the Rings movies, the Uruk-hai are almost head to toe black or very, very dark gray. Their skin is a very, very, very dark black, gray, red. Their armor is a very, very dark metallic. Their clothing is like a very, very dark gray. So it's almost impossible to have any color on them. So we need to have something to variety, make a little bit of variety. So I'm going to end up with the wash. Their clothing is going to be dark green. Their skin is going to be like a muddy, desaturated red. And these colors are complementary and they're going to play off of each other. Their boots are just going to be a simple brown. To make these guys a little bit white hand Isengardy, I'm going to use white on the little tassel wraps that are on their spears. And then I use this ivory as what I dry brush them in. I might occasionally mix it in with a color. I'm going to mix it in with that tan to make a slightly different color for their spear hefts. So I've got my paintbrush. It's not a particularly good paintbrush because we're just going to be starting by slopping on this scale hide. Any light desaturated green will work. You could also use kind of like a military uniform color mixed with a little bit of white or a little bit of gray. And we're just going to slop it everywhere where there's cloth. Be careful, this is not cloth, this is their knees. You could make that pants. I'm going to make that the red of the knees. And they have a little here in their chest. And we're just going to go all the way around and we're going to hit everything. Now down here underneath the shield, I could squeeze this under there, but I'm not even going to bother because I don't want to get on the backside of the shield. I want to leave the backside of the shield in black. And then when I get to these figures in the back, I do want to make sure I hit the tops of their shoulders and that little area of exposed cloth in the back, but I'm not going to go down underneath their back armor and bother because you can't see it. If you can't reach it, you can't see it. And if you can barely see it, don't bother. For these figures here on the back row, same thing. I'm going to hit their chest and their shoulders. These guys in the real back middle, I'm not even going to hit their chest. I'm just going to hit their shoulders because that's the part that's exposed. And of course, the areas on the back. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to finish up with this and then I'm going to let this dry and then we'll start working on the skin and some of the other materials. Okay everyone, we're back. The scaly hide or whatever your light desaturated green has now dried, and again I promise this looks really bright. It's going to be dulled down and be dingy and Uruk-Hai-ish, Uruk-Hai-y, whatever the adjective is, after we're done with it. The next is the skin, and as I mentioned earlier, the skin of the Uruk-Hai is going to be kind of hard to paint, especially in 10mm, because if you watch the movies, the Uruk-Hai skin is this blackish red, and that's just simply not going to show up very well on almost any figure, let alone 10mm or 12mm figures. So what I've come up with is a bit of a compromise. I took pure red, which is just Army Painter's kind of like medium, regular-ish red, and I want to desaturate this a little bit, but if I put a gray into it, it's going to turn pink, and it just doesn't, that's not very Uruk-Hai. So what I did is I took a light tan earth by Vallejo, but any tannish brown will work. And when you mix it together, you get this red that's still a little pinky, but it's kind of like this, I don't know, it's not quite terracotta. It's a little pink, it's a little red, and when we combine it with the wash that we're going to use later, it really works out quite perfectly. Now, there's just a couple of spots on these figures that you need to be watch out for. Obviously, you've got the faces, and don't worry about going too far down to their necks, because that is black, because I primed them, and so well, it's going to be black. It's going to be in shadow, especially because these Uruk-Hai are supposed to be dark and dingy and deadly and all the other alliterative Ds. So just make sure you don't get it onto those shirts that we already painted. And other than the faces, you've also got some of these hands. So just hit the hands. Some of them are on top of the spear halves. You can't see the hand that's holding the shield, so that's not a big deal. There's this hand on this guy right here that I just kind of have to hit the side of. And then finally, it's your decision whether you want to give them pants or if you want their knees to be skin. I have decided to go with skin knees, just so I have another pop of red on them, because this is really going to be the brightest color on them. I'm not going to bother with the leg that's behind the shield. You're barely going to be able to see it. I'm not going to bother with this guy's leg that's all the way down back here. You're not going to be able to see it. In fact, most of these guys' legs, unless they're the Uruk-Hai on the outside or on the back, you can barely see their legs, so it doesn't really require that much extra work. Don't worry about the boots. We're going to do those next. We just need to make sure that we avoid the cloth, let this dry, and come back for the brown bits and bobs. Now our last step before the metallics is going to be to paint, and it might be a little hard to see here. There's a little wrap and a tassel on these spear halves. And to give them just a bit of lightness, because most of this miniature is going to be fairly dingy and dark, and also because these are supposed to be my Uruk-Hai serving under Saruman and the White Hand, I'm going to be painting them as white. Now, I personally like mixing my Procro Bold Titanium White with my Vallejo Ivory. I find that mix just is really great, but whatever white or slightly off white you have is going to be fine. And you just want to get all the way around. They happen to have this little cross bit here. And don't worry if you get it on the spear half, because we're going to paint that in metal. Some of these go over the hand, and obviously whatever miniatures, if you're not painting exactly these Knucklebones 3D printed figures, where you're putting this little bit of decorative white, or whether you do or you make it a different color, is totally up to you. So I will paint in the rest of these and then come back and talk about metallics choices. So the very last pre-wash step is, of course, the metallics. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I have a penchant for mixing my own metallic colors. Specifically, I find regular acrylic metallics, like from the Army Painter, a little gloopy, and I really enjoy the Vallejo metal airbrush colors, like this burnt iron, but they're very thin to paint on. So what I end up doing is about a 50-50 mix of these so that it's easier to paint without being too gloopy. I want it to be bright enough, but have a little bit of that darkness. Of course, if you have a metallic you can just use a nice medium silver, maybe with a hint of brown in it. And I've got it mixed up. And there's a couple areas we need to hit. Of course, your figures might be different, but if you're using the Knucklebones figures that I am painting here, the big obvious one is the shield. And you don't have to worry about going too deep on these shields, just anything that you can reach and anything that is visible. Then there is, of course, the helmet, but the big one is going to be the chest and shoulder pieces. Now, this is probably the point where you want to be the most delicate, so you don't have to go back in and clean up the greens and the skins that you've laid down, but those shoulder pieces are going to be a big piece of hitting the metallic, so it looks like they're wearing some kind of armor, and same with getting at least a little bit into those recesses on their chest. On their back, it's a similar story. Those shoulder pieces continue onto their backs, and then they've got this back piece, plus these little, like, kind of dangly things. I just paint them all as, at 10 millimeter, they all just look like one piece. If you zoom in on the STLs, they do appear to be separate, but that's for something's blown up. There's also little bits that go under their arms, so I'm just going to paint that like it's all one big kind of like really rudimentary chest piece that's wrapped around them and held up by these little shoulder pauldron things, and the helmets and the spear halves. So I'm going to get rid of this camera because painting inside these delicate areas with this camera is quite difficult. We'll come back and we'll talk about wash choice. Now we come to what I think is one of the most important steps when we're painting these small figures if you're using a wash, and that is, of course, your selection of wash, because it's going to affect how dark you make things and also the general tone of the miniature. Now, because these are Uruk-Hai, and you could use this for painting regular orcs as well if you don't want to use the red skin, we're going to want something that is dark and dingy. Now, I'm using Army Painter washes, but of course, you can use Games Workshop or others. I will be using, I think, dark tone on its own to black, strong tone to brown. So mixing these two together, or the GW equivalents, Nuln Oil and Agrex Earthshade. And then I'm going to thin them down a little bit because they're still a little too strong for what I want with the quick shade wash mixing medium. So I'm using a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. If you don't have the wash mixing medium, you can just use water, or you can use some sort of other acrylic medium, and you end up with a dark brown muddy wash, which is really going to darken down pretty much everything on these miniatures. So glop it on there. Just make sure you don't get huge pools of it sitting in weird places, although there aren't a lot of big flat surfaces on this miniature. The front of the shield is probably one of the only ones that see that? I don't want this giant glob of wash to be sitting there. I do want it to just sink into those recesses. So push it around a little bit, and when this dries, we'll get to see what it looks like and just do very, very briefest of highlights. So now that the wash is dried, you can really see it's dinged down these orcs. Now there's just a couple of minor steps that we are going to take here. And that is, we are going to do some very, very selected highlights. Now you could really leave them here at this point, but I want to give them just that little extra touch. So I'm going to take a silver color, any silver color will work, and I am just going to get a little bit of that, and I'm going to apply it to the tips of their spears. So even if these weapons look like they have not been kept up the best, at least those tips are sharp and deadly, because they're well used and they are instruments of war. So you'll get that little glint on the tip. If you wanted, you could go through and do their shield spikes a little bit, but it's not strictly necessary, and you certainly wouldn't do that to the enemies that you couldn't reach. The only other highlight that we are going to do is we're going to take our original cloth color, in my case it was scaly hide, and we are going to thin it down a lot with water. Maybe 2 parts water for 1 part paint, because we do not want this to be super opaque. We want this to be fairly translucent. So you can see that it is a fairly thin color there. We're going to be applying this as a highlight, but we don't want to lose all the dinged down fabric that we worked so hard on. I'm really going to be focusing on the shoulders because that's what you can see on all of these orcs. And then of course for the orcs that are just on the outside, I'm going to be doing a little bit of outlining of their sleeves. But all these orcs that are on the inside, see, I can't even barely reach some of their shoulders, so you don't need to do them all, just what you can easily reach. And we'll go through, we'll highlight these, and then there's one final thing I think is really going to make them pop. So I will set that up, and we'll come back for our very last step. So our very last step is what used to be these white tassels. I want to punch back up since they have dinged down. So I'm going to take my original mix of white and ivory, and I really would strongly recommend that you do not use pure white because it's very rare to see pure white out there in the real world. Nothing is that clean. So some sort of very close to white, off-white, and I'm going to come in with my brush, and I'm going to try to hit the raised areas, but I'm just going to draw little horizontal lines across the front. And then we're on these particular models, there's this little wrapping that looks like it's holding the spearhead to the haft. And that's it. I'm not going to go to any of the figures in the back, just these figures in the front. Just tiny little horizontal lines that are going to look like wrinkles in the rope or the fabric or whatever this is, and just give it a little pop of brightness against what is otherwise a fairly dingy model. Purposefully dingy. These are the Uruk-Hai, of course. But that's it. That'll give them something. I will let this dry, and then of course it's not done until it's based and done, so I'm going to do a little bit of a dirt with a little bit of grass base on this, and we can see what the final glamour shots will look like. So now it's based, therefore it's done. I used the basing mix that you've seen previously in my 10mm figures, and that is a mix of sand and grout, a dark wash over brown paint, and then a little bit of a combination of 2mm static grass and also flock. And so the light greens of the grass kind of accent against the dinginess of the Uruk-Hai. And I don't even bother going in between them. In fact, I don't even have any grout in between them. So if you're looking straight down, you can see the seam between them because they had relatively large integrated bases that I might need to fix for the next time. But if you're looking at them from ahead or even from behind, and pretty much anything except straight down or straight from the side, you're never going to notice. So that's it for these 10mm Uruk-Hai. Of course, if you had printed them at the original 100% scale, they work great as orcs as well. And there is a version that just has swords and shields. So when I'm done with all that, I'll do a bit of a tour of my White Hand Isengard army. But that is it for this video. And of course, happy Orktober or Uruk-tober. Everyone have a great time out there. Keep on printing, keep on painting, and keep on playing.